Hi everybody, and welcome to the last of the videos on the digestive system. So by this point you have gotten all the major functions here of the digestive organs and accessory organs. But now we're going to look at the last piece of the puzzle, and that is this. How does our body deal with this? We absorb the nutrients in the small intestine, so what happens to them next? And so what we've really been talking about before all this is what the first step is, and that's nutrition. It's taking in the vitamins, minerals, and foods that are eaten and used by our body. But how are they used? And that's what we're going to look at today. So let me give you the big picture here. How do we get the energy from the food that we eat? Because there's a lot of it in that food, packed in all the bonds that are holding the molecules together. Because we really need that energy to do a lot of things. We need to make stuff in our body, perhaps for reproduction, pumping ions against their concentration gradient, our muscles and bones, but a lot of it goes to maintaining our temperature. We're warm-blooded, so a lot of the energy from the food we get goes to maintaining our 98.6 degree Fahrenheit temperature. So what do we do to do all these things in our body to maintain our temperature, etc.? We have to eat food, and we burn those fuels, whether they're carbs, lipids, or proteins. And the thing is, what's really cool, we can really harness this process, step-by-step release of energy, to maximize how much energy we can get from food. It's a pretty cool process. So let's begin. Here is, for example, here's that piece of toast you had this morning, and these are the little molecules that are making up your bread, and they're held together by a bond there. And so what your digestive system does is it releases that bond and it breaks it down. So perhaps that toast then gets converted into 2 molecules of glucose, and that glucose has a lot of energy packed into it. And we're going to use that energy from glucose in order to power something else in our body, in order to say, take these 2 molecules and put them together to make a protein that's now in your arm, like a muscle fiber. So we use energy from food to power other processes in our body. It's called energy coupling, and that's how we do the things we need to do inside our cells. So what's the point of all this stuff? Well, let's look at the big picture still. We have these nutrients, they got absorbed in the villi, our circulatory system picks the nutrients up, and now we're in the process of delivering them to all of our cells. And once those nutrients get to our cells, they're going to go straight to this place. And they're going to convert the energy in those nutrients, for example glucose, into an energy currency our body can use, called ATP. And that's the whole job of mitochondria, is to make energy. And that energy is in the form of ATP. So what's ATP? ATP is a little bundle of energy, a little energy nugget called adenosine triphosphate. Tri meaning 3. They have 3 phosphates. There's one, and there's one. But this last one right here is really unstable. It's so high energy, it doesn't want to be attached to the other 2. It wants to be cut off from that molecule. And so we do that. We cut it off, and in doing so, it's so high energy, there's so much energy here to power cellular processes. So what's left is an ADP, diphosphate. And sure, we could probably take off these other phosphates, but they're not as high energy, so it's a lot more stable of a molecule. And we have an ADP and this free phosphate floating around here, but we got all the energy. We can harness it to do work. So what does that look like in terms of our muscles? And this is a really important slide here. ATP is very unstable. It wants to get rid of that last phosphate. So it's only used for short-term energy. But here's how it works. Take a look at this picture down here. We have the food that we eat. It gets broken down, catabolized into something like glucose, the piece of bread here. That glucose is energy, but it's not the right form that our body can use. So what does it do? It converts glucose into bundles of ATP. There's the 3 phosphates. And those ATP, because they are so unstable, they get used almost instantaneously, for example, to power the bicep in your arm. And we do that by severing that last bond, releasing the energy for that to happen. So what's left is ADP and that free phosphate. and it just cycles through. We use energy from the food we eat to put that phosphate back on. It gets used again, and so on. This cycle right here that we just did happens 10 million times per second. Per second. That number is nearly unfathomable. This process happens in every muscle that many times. Okay? So let's take a look at specifically the different foods we eat and how they get catabolized and converted into the final product that our body can use. And the first one, the best one, is carbs. They're our best energy source. Their final product, as I'd mentioned earlier, is glucose. It's a really easy process to convert glucose into ATP. But if we have extra, that glucose gets converted to storage as glycogen. Because remember, we can't store ATP, so we store it as something a little more stable. The second best energy source are fats or lipids. Their final product that gets broken down into nutrients are called fatty acids. They can also be converted to ATP pretty easily. But again, if we have too many, they get stored as something called adipose. And the final energy source, food type that we take in are proteins. And these aren't for energy. They can be used as energy, but they're really not ideal. They're more for a structural building block type of material. So the proteins that we eat get broken down into nutrients such as amino acids, and then they get rearranged in our body to make proteins like our hair and nails and teeth and skin and muscle and bone and things like that. But remember, the whole point of catabolism is to make as much ATP as possible. Now, we're going to first look at carbohydrates because those are the most ideal molecules to harvest energy from. Now, we could do it like this in our bodies. We could take those carbs and simply do combustion, burn them, and we release CO2, water. Yeah, that happens. We exhale that stuff. But the energy is in the form of heat, and it just gets released. There's no way of harnessing all that, controlling it to power other processes. So we do something very similar, but it's better. We call it respiration. And this is what happens in our mitochondria. We take that food, that fuel, those carbohydrates like that wood pile here, and slowly release the energy. And instead of releasing it as heat, we release it as something that we can actually use, which is ATP. In the process, we make some CO2 and water, which we exhale. So it's the same kind of process, it's just a much more controlled release. So the two steps for carbohydrate metabolism are as such. So this is where the small intestine finishes the job, converts our carbs to glucose. They get absorbed by our cells. And the first stop is in the cytoplasm, and that glucose gets converted into something called pyruvic acid. You may see it also called pyruvate. Two small molecules, and this process is called glycolysis. Every living organism practices glycolysis. But the thing is, for us, it's not enough energy. It produces a very little amount of ATP, maybe like 2 to 4 molecules. That's it. Not nearly enough that we need. So, in us, if we take in oxygen, which we're always doing, those pyruvates then move on to the mitochondria in our cells. And the mitochondria take those pyruvates, they put them through this thing called the citric acid cycle, and they make a ton of ATP from that process, roughly 32 to 34 ATP per 1 molecule of glucose. It's awesome. And in the meantime, we have a little waste product. We have some CO2 and some water vapor, but that's about it. So that's respiration, cellular respiration. There's 2 steps, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle makes a ton of ATP for our cells. And that's the point, is to make ATP. All right. Now, like I said, if we have too much glucose and we don't need to do all this and make the ATP, we do this process. We convert that into something called glycogen. So it's glycogenesis. You can kind of see the 2 words come together, and it's the creation of glycogen. Happens in your liver. It's just converting glucose into a storage format. And the insulin really tells the liver when to do this. So if we have too much sugar in our blood, we store it as glycogen. Now, I mentioned that we can also eat fats and proteins for metabolism, and they still end up with the citric acid cycle. They still make ATP. It's just not as an efficient process if you're doing it with proteins and fats. Carbohydrates are the most efficient way to do that. But I just wanted to show you that it is possible. because the point is to make ATP. And your body will do that at whatever means possible. So we're almost finished. There are other players that help metabolism, and that's vitamins and minerals. Really, the only difference is that vitamins are organic, whereas minerals are inorganic. And you should know the two different categories of vitamins, whether or not they're soluble in fats or water. And you can see here, it's a little blurry, but you see the water soluble and the fat soluble. You can actually have too many vitamins. And here's the important part here. If you have too many, it's called hypervitaminosis. And the problem comes not necessarily in the water soluble, because you'll just usually excrete those through your urine. It's the ones that are fat soluble. That can cause a lot of havoc because they can accumulate. They're not as easy to get out of our system. And so they can accumulate in our system and really cause some trouble. So just be careful with overloading yourself with all these vitamins all the time. We get most of our vitamins if we have a pretty balanced diet. However, some people could have avitaminosis, which is a deficiency in a particular vitamin. So for example, vitamin C, a deficiency there. That disease would be called scurvy. And there you could go through all of them, and they all have their own names for them. And lastly, we have minerals. These are inorganic, and they just help out. They help metabolism. They help the proteins and enzymes in your body function. And you don't have to memorize these. I would say, though, a pretty important one is iron. Good example. Iron is held in our red blood cells, and it attaches to hemoglobin. And without iron, our hemoglobin couldn't carry oxygen and CO2 throughout our body. So it's a pretty critical mineral that helps out hemoglobin. And finally, to wrap everything up, let's look at some metabolic rates. So right now, you're probably practicing your BMR, your basal metabolic rate. This is just your normal metabolism rates. It's the bare bones. Here's what it takes to survive and keep doing what you're doing. It's the rate at which we break down food in order to keep ourselves alive. Now the TMR, the total metabolic rate, is actually how much energy you actually use each day, and we measure that in calories, different than how much you need to just survive. So if you want to lose weight, you just consume less calories than your total metabolic rate, and unfortunately, if you end up gaining weight, that means you're consuming more calories than your total metabolic rate. It just all seems so simple right there, and that's really all it comes down to. So that's the full picture of metabolism and digestion. Thanks for listening.